link, and you can find my blog. Daniel can't be with us tonight because he is ill, but Daniel's got some creds there too. Daniel, I think, is he just got back from, he's ill because he got back from basically touring South America. He went and spoke at a conference in Colombia, spoke at a conference in Brazil, and wore himself down to nothing, and then he got sick as soon as he got back. Of course, as soon as you get worn down, then you step on an airplane. Not good. So big thanks on this presentation to Zamgirl and Zamboy. So that's Charlene and Randy from the Dominican Republic. They're from the company Cross Geeks, and they saw, or Daniel was talking with them, and he saw their presentation down in, I believe it was in Colombia, and they talked about, they basically presented what I'm about to present in their own kind of style, and Daniel went, that's a really good topic, can I borrow that presentation? And they said, sure, and brought the presentation over, and then one of our staff members who speaks Spanish generously translated it to English, which was awesome, and then I kind of took it and transferred it over to our slide deck and added my own demos and things like that. So big thanks to them. They form the foundation of what I'm about to present here. So speaking of, let's go through the main topics. So I'm going to talk about, I've broken things into, or they've broken things into about 6 pieces. I've stayed roughly on course with how they broke the topics up. So user interface, user experience, maintenance, security, performance, and customization, all important things. A lot of these things have crossover topics. So if you're talking about UI, you can also talk about performance. Talk about maintenance, you can also talk about security, all that kind of stuff. So there's a little cross-pollination. None of it's cut and dry, so, but lots of good material here. So let's start with your user interface. Okay, I think everybody, so who's used Xamarin and who hasn't? So who has used Xamarin? Yes, a little bit. Who shipped an app to production with Xamarin? Yeah. Very few. Okay, cool. Who's used MVVM to build Xamarin? Yeah, no? Yeah, I see a couple people shaking their heads. It's a small room. You can put your hand up. Don't be shy. It's really interesting to see like who's using it, who's using code behind, why. Like, it's generally recommended to use MVVM because if you want to switch between how you're building things, it makes it a lot easier. You can lift your view models and use them in other places. So if you're using Xamarin Forms and you decide, you know what, I am always customizing and using native controls anyways. I'm building all my screens native. I'm actually going to switch and use native UI instead of Xamarin Forms UI. You can just pick up your view models and use them in native UI. So it makes it a little more flexible, a little more portable. View models are also, because you've separated and abstracted Xamarin Forms out, you don't have that dependency, you can test your view models. So your view models become testable software that you can build unit tests against and functional tests against. Makes it really easy to work on. So MVVM, for those who don't know, is model, view, view model. So your model is the shape of your data that you're bringing into your app. Your view is how you're displaying that data, and your view model is a kind of translation between the two. So it's basically a way of mapping between what's coming in on your model and how you're going to display it on the screen. Now, I'd asterisk that because you don't always want to overload your model, and we'll kind of talk about that as we move forward to the next few slides. But your view model should not contain a lot of view logic. They should be relatively pure, just like displaying data in a pure format if you can possibly get away with it. It's not always possible, but there's some tricks to kind of keep your view models relatively clean. So let's talk about that. So the first tool that you'd want to use for this is data triggers. So who's heard of data triggers? Yes, no data triggers? Okay, cool. This is useful then. Good. So data triggers are declarative conditions. So you can write conditions in your XAML to set properties on controls on your screen. what does that look like? We'll get to that in the next slide. But it basically, the purpose of it is take things that you'd normally put in your view model, like condition flags. If this is empty, don't display this. If this is longer than this amount of characters, display this validation message, things like that. You can put that in your XAML code so it lives completely in your view instead of having to write some view model logic for that. So it removes that view logic from your view model, that C# code from your view model, and you can put it in your XAML code. So this is a little small, smaller than I'd want it to be. So basically, what this is showing is a label. And you know what? Andrew, could you do me a favor and shut off this bank of lights, please? Just so we can see this a little better. So this is a label. It's binding to a, nope. Yeah, perfect. Does that help? Can you kind of see what's going on there? Okay. So we're going welcome to, we're using a string format to present the bound value in that welcome to string. So it'll say welcome to whatever that bound value is. So our binding is then set to event name. So it'll go welcome to whatever is in our event name in our view model. So our view model is going to expose a property called event name. And this is going to grab that event name and populate that formatted string with whatever event name is. So then we've got a second line there with the second binding for is visible. So we're going to toggle the visibility of this whole label depending on if that event name is populated. So if the event name is blank, is visible is going to be false. If the event name has something in it, then it's going to be true and it's going to display on screen. So that prevents us from having just a welcome to and then a blank value in there. Because if event name is empty, it'll just say welcome to and that's all it'll say, because nothing gets substituted in that string. So you'd want to definitely hide that if it had no value. So this is with no trigger. So the view model before has quite a bit of logic. So we start at the top, we've got a backing property for our event name. So you always have to have, you can't use autoprops when you're doing any type of two-way binding in Xamarin. You have to use member back properties. And the reason for that is because you have to bind to an interface called, or you have to use an interface, implement an interface called iNotifyPropertyChanged. So iNotifyPropertyChanged is what we're doing in our set properties. So you can see I've got set property being called in two different setters there. So I've got set property in event name and set property in event name is populated. And that's telling the screen that needs to refresh when that data is changed. That's basically all you have to think about it. iNotifyPropertyChanged is you're notifying your view that you've made a change and it's going to go and reflect that change, redraw the screen. So what's happening here is event name. When we populate event name, so when the setter gets called, first we're telling the screen to redraw and setting the backing property. So that's what that set property line does. The line underneath, so the event name is populated. So we're then checking the value of the string, the event name string, and we're setting the Boolean value of this property. The event name is populated. And we're telling the screen to redraw again when we set that value. So screen redraws here, then we check if it has a value, and the screen may redraw again if we've changed it to have content or not have content. So we end up having just this property just to maintain that flag. So we have this one to maintain whether the label is going to be displayed, plus the backing property up there. So it's quite a bit of code, plus we have the call to actually set that flag in there. So let's see what happens when we move it to a trigger. So now we've got a data trigger. So of course XML is pretty verbose. The tooling makes it pretty easy to write this. So don't be intimidated by this kind of code. It's pretty easy to parse if you're used to any type of markup language. So the XAML language here makes it seem like there's more going on than there is, but there really isn't. So everything that we've added is between the label.triggers here. We no longer need this. This is a copy paste error by me. And the data trigger here So we're saying we're looking at a type of label, so that's the parent control. We're going to bind to event name, so it has the same binding as what we're populating text with. And we're going to check if the value is empty. So this is just an empty string. And when it is empty, we're going to set is visible to false. So that removes that all that logic that we had to tell the screen to redraw, all that kind of stuff from the view model. So this is the cleaned up view model. There's significantly less code there because we don't have to constantly watch or have a whole bunch of cascading values, cascading properties when we change one property. So when we change event name, say you've got a bunch of elements on your screen, on your view, that when event name matches a certain value, so if it's empty, we're going to hide a bunch of stuff. Or say you've got like an options contact sheet. So you've displayed a contact sheet with a bunch of options, so like a picker. And you go, okay, I'm going to pick one. And it changes what's on screen. So you're toggling visibility depending on the value you've selected. You would have to have all of those reflected in your setter of your whatever your event name is. So if you say we wanted to detect, say we had 15 things on screen that we all wanted to hide or change the value of, change some kind of property on it, when we change event name to match, I don't know, TO mobile dev. So then you'd have to call in the setter of event name, you'd have to call each one of those 15 properties to make sure that they're updated with the appropriate value. If you use triggers, keeps the view model clean. You put that logic in the view where it really goes, and it keeps your view model nice and easy and simple to deal with. So one good way of lifting some of that logic out of your view model and into your view, where it really belongs, because it's view specific logic. It's really where you'd want that to live. The next thing, so this is not necessarily something that is always used to clean up a view model, but it can be used to clean up a view model. Converters basically are a markup extension that you use in XAML to convert from one value type to another value type, or it doesn't even have to be between types. You could just convert between two different strings if you wanted to. So it's an easy way to hook in, grab the original value that you've bound to and make it display it, or make it actually become something else. Who's used a converter? Anyone? Anybody written a converter? Emily's written converters.
I have.
So it removes a lot of the specific casts and mapping from your view model. So let's take a look at that one. Really wish I had made this code bigger. I feel like I've resized my code at some point. Okay, so we've got same thing, welcome to blah. And we've got a binding for event populated. I think I didn't paste in the code I wanted to in here. Nope, I did not. So let's go right into my app. So I'm going to toggle between two apps as I'm showing you these changes. So so this is just an app I built to demonstrate what we're talking about tonight. The other app that we're looking at is, this is an app that Daniel and I built. We built this app just to kind of experiment with some of the newer changes in Xamarin. So there's one that's called App 1. I'll be showing you that in JetBrains Rider. And then if we're in Visual Studio, we're looking at the Meetup app. And this is an app that is already on our GitHub and you can take a look into. So I'm going to start with App 1. So this is our welcome view model. This is the example I used for the event name populated. So we can actually take a look at this in action. So yes, let's stop and rerun. It's a little bit bigger. Okay, so you can see I've got two labels on the screen. Both say welcome to TO Mobile Dev. and both will behave the same. So both look for the event name to be populated and will come back as soon as become visible again as soon as we have text in the event name variable. So we're displaying those in the two different styles that we just talked about. So we've got the first one that is using the flag from the view model, and we've got the second one that uses the data trigger here. So that's 6 lines of code there. It ends up being about the same. So I've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you save 1 line, but your view model is a lot cleaner, because as soon as you look at your view model and you've got, like, really, delete that, delete all this, and delete this as well. So the view model becomes significantly less code when I'm using the data trigger. So the next piece I wanted to show is converter. So first I'll show you the converter I've built, and then we'll go look at the usage of it. So I've got this converter. It's called notification priority color converter. So what this basically does is it looks at an enumeration value, so low, medium, high, critical, and will return a color value based on what your original enumeration came in as. So if it comes in as low, we're just going to keep the color as transparent. If it comes in as medium, we're going to set the color to yellow, orange, red, so on and so forth. And then we've got some protection here to make sure that we're covering ourselves as far as exceptions being thrown. So I'd actually meant to put in a section, but I'll just take a little tangent right now. Exception handling in Xamarin Forms is extremely important. Did anybody see the joke going around? Well, who's on Twitter? No, just me? All right, a bunch of us? Okay, cool. There's a joke going around on Twitter where somebody said, somebody's manager came to them and said, I want to make our web app feel more like a mobile app. And the developer said, okay. And then there's a code snippet that says, when window.onError equals window.close. So close the window and crash right out as soon as there is an error. Because that's what happens in mobile dev. So as soon as you get into mobile development and you're building a Xamarin Forms or a native app, whatever it may be, Xamarin native, if you have an exception that's unhandled, the operating system kicks you right out, and you go back to the home screen and tells you, hey, your app has crashed. If it keeps crashing, you get some more dire actions. You can tell the app to not run in the background. You can tell the app to, or some people will just uninstall the app. So you don't want that. Handle your exceptions, very important. Okay, so this converts from that notification priority to a color. So let's go take a look at where that's going on. So I'll show you the actual screen here. So we've got 4 different alerts. We've got cool new feature, enable 2-factor authentication, verify your email address, and then your trial expires because I need money, pay me. So we've got the 4 different examples of the different notification priority and being translated to the different color types. So let's show how that actually manifests itself on screen. Someone has a stream.
Good.
It's streaming.
It's streaming.
It's actually working?
Yeah.
I am shocked. I'm completely shocked. Okay, so, well, I guess we should start with the view model here. So, notification view model. So the view model is very simple. I have a list of notifications. I'm just initializing it in the constructor. I'm not doing any changes. I'm not informing the view of any changes. It's just a static list. It's fine. Just for demo purposes. If you're doing this with data that could be coming from your back end or changing on the fly or anything like that, you'd want to use some form of observable collection. So there's an observable collection. There's some open source components for observable range collection. So observable collection will only take one item at a time, and it calls the iNotify property changed event. So property changed event gets called every time you add an item to the screen. So if you've got a list of 5,000 items and you're taking it from the list from a back end and putting it into the observable collection, and every time you call add, it's going to tell the screen to redraw every single time. So you got to be careful with that. Observable range collection is far more efficient. You can load a whole list in, it'll load the whole list in the observable collection and then tell it to redraw. So you have to be kind of careful about how you're using that. Anyways, in this case, we're just using a list. We've got static values. This is good. So we've got each one of the notifications. Then we go and take a look at the notifications page. And what I've done here is, so first of all, I've brought in my converter namespace. So I've told it where to find my converter. Pretty important. Then I've added to the content page resources, I've added a resource dictionary which contains the converter. So I basically tell it, here's what I'm going to call my converter, and then I can use the converter. So down here, where I do my binding, I'm just doing it on my border color of my frame here. I'm saying bind to priority, and then here's the converter I'm going to use. So converter, I'm referencing the static resource that I've specified above, our notification color converter. And the notification color converter, as we just looked at, takes in the notification priority and returns a color. And it returns it to the screen so we can shift from one type to another. It's almost like a mapping construct. And again, careful of exception handling in here. You want to make sure you're relatively thorough. Okay, that's converters. Skip ahead. Visual State Manager is similar to triggers, but it's got, the states are mutually exclusive. So if you have a trigger, you can have multiple states and have them do, you can apply multiple triggers. If you're using a Visual State Manager, you only have one state at a time. I'm going to show you a very simple example of that, and you might have picked up that I was already using it on this welcome screen. So on this welcome screen, we've got a selected and unselected, basically. So if you're in the field, it's changing the background color. If it's out of focus, it goes back to its original. Really, really simple. Again, instead of trying to do that in your view model, you simply use a Visual State Manager here. This one is a little more verbose than I would like it to be, but it is pretty effective for this sort of thing. So we've got our normal state where the background is white. We've got our focus state where the background is light gray, and it's attached to that entry, so that event name entry. So as soon as we focus on it, it's going to turn to light gray. As soon as we remove focus, it's going to go back to white. So pretty simple, pretty easy to manage. It's relatively easy to write, but I'd like to see them have a little shorthand on this personally. This one was taken from UWP. So UWP had this a long time ago, and UWP devs liked it, so they rolled it into Forms, which is kind of nice. It's a nice little feature. I've seen it used in some really interesting ways before, so you can get kind of creative with it. The next piece, and this one I don't have as much on, I guess I do have a few layouts. So make sure you're using the right layout for the job. So this is important because particularly in Android, or if you're working with older versions of Xamarin Forms, there's no layout compression built in. So it'll display view within a view within a view within a view, and your UI hierarchy will be, 15 levels deep. And you'll go, why is my app slow? And then somebody will come along and take a look and go, Why do you have stack layout wrapped in stack layout wrapped in another stack layout? Because that's super inefficient. It has to keep track of that. And every time you ask Android to draw text and figure out, calculate how wide it needs to be, it has to work really hard. It's got a really poor algorithm. So if you've got, say you've got stack layout and stack layout and a stack layout and a stack layout, 6 levels deep, let's say, and you put that in the list view. And so then you load your 6,000 records in. And then you're scrolling and you go, why is my scroll laggy? Well, you're making it do a lot of work for every cell it has to render. So the idea is make sure you know what you're drawing and use the most efficient layout for that particular thing you're trying to draw. I see stack layout uses a hammer and everything is a nail. Don't do that. I think my rule of thumb is start with a grid, build things in a grid, and you'll get a lot faster results. Grids are pretty quick at drawing on screen. Stack layouts tend to be slow unless you actually just have a very simple stack of vertical items. Flex layouts are kind of interesting because they can fold and scale and do all kinds of nifty things. So it's almost like a grid on steroids. It's roughly based around the flexbox. If people know CSS, the whole flexbox where you can make things constrained to an area or constrain each cell to a specific shape. You can constrain it to how many columns it has, how many rows it has, all kinds of different things. So it just has a various ways of constraining your layout. Absolute layout, relative layout, these are probably ones that you'd want to use little more. Some of the relative layout is relatively inefficient, so you want to be careful with relative layout as well. And absolute layout, this is when you're going for a pixel perfect design, or if you want like a root layout for everything to live in that you're adjusting on screen. So it gives you the fine grain of control where you can do pixel by pixel. You also want to be careful of that because as soon as you start getting to different screen sizes, it might not render the way you expect. Relative's the same way because you can adjust relative layouts pixel by pixel. So be careful with your layouts with relative. So in the Meetup app, I think we are using, it's quite the contrast between that black layout, hey? In the Meetup app, pretty sure I have a decent sample of a relative layout, or sorry, a flex layout. So bring that up quickly, if I can find it. Yeah. So we'll launch this one really quick. Hopefully it launches. I think I was having some issues with it earlier. So I've got a flex layout here where I'm displaying a list of controls. Yeah, here we go. So this is my flex layout here. I haven't told it how to wrap. I've just kind of told it how wide things need to be, and it's wrapped it on its own. It's done a really nice job of laying that out. So I just basically said flex layout, and then this is something interesting here. I'm using a class. I'm using a class from a CSS file. So I have a CSS file in here in my styles folder. So I have core CSS. Core CSS has a social definition. That's the class I'm using. I'm telling it to use a flex wrap type of wrap. Justify content with space around, giving it a bit of a margin. And I've also styled the icon underneath to have some very specific dimensions. But the ability to use CSS in your app, if you're already using CSS in your web app, and then you're building a mobile app, it's really nice to use those styles across both. And you can do things like you can use SAS templates right in Xamarin. Visual Studio supports processing SAS templates in CSS. All kinds of power there. I talked about this when it first came out, but I don't know if anybody saw that here, so new audience, I'll say it again. When you're using CSS to build Xamarin, you start thinking about design a little bit different. It just inherently happens because you have a domain-specific language to define your styles. You start focusing a little bit more on styles. it ends up being a really good thing. You get that nice centralized place where you can go to adjust your styles. Works really well. Highly recommend trying that. Okay, so flex layout, CSS, cool. Any questions so far? All right. Okay, let's get into a little bit about community packages. So there's a couple out there that are really, really nice. I don't know why I full screen this. I'm just going to take it down again in a second. So the two that I'm going to point out specifically are Settings View and Pancake View. They're both really nice screens that just shortcut a lot of your work. So if you're trying to make screens for settings, nice toggleable controls, enter some values. Settings View is really nice. Pancake View is really rich UI controls, so they're really nice. I'll show you some of those. That was a mistake. I'm not going to make that same mistake again. So, I have this running, right? App 1. Okay, so let's look at Settings View first. So this is using like a basic sample from Settings View. This is all stuff that I've just like kind of placed on screen. There's not a ton behind this. It's kind of meant to function as a settings view. So it makes it really easy to build a screen that looks like this in just a couple of minutes with not very much markup. I'll show you what's actually sitting behind there markup wise. As you can see, there's not a ton of markup here. It's less than 40 lines, which is awesome. Makes it super efficient for building screens to contain your settings. So we're not doing anything too crazy in here either. Like a lot of this is just hard coded, but even if you're binding to it, it's still going to be very, very terse. So it's a nice way of building, like really this is kind of an impressive screen with how much is on it for how little markup there is. And I'm just using the settings view control that comes the package that I've added into my project. So pretty easy. It started with this one. Again, just like I added the NuGet package. I had to add one line to my app delegate and one line to my main activities. So just the zoom controls were the same. So I have to call init on both platforms, and then I can start using the control in my pages. And I didn't have to add styles. I didn't have to add anything. Just ready to go. So really nice there. The next one is Pancake View, and Pancake View is really, really, like I said, this is UI centric, right? So if you want pretty looking screens, Pancake View gets you a lot of the nice controls to make really pretty screens. Gradient backgrounds, multicolor gradients, rounded corners, all kinds of different borders, border gradients, nice, shadows, elevation, vignette. So this makes it really easy to stand up some really nice looking UI. I will show you the markup to that. This is another one where I just copy pasted the demo. So there's a lot of text in here describing what's going on. So don't be overwhelmed. I should have stripped this down, but I was very lazy. So most of this stuff is pretty simple. So let's isolate it down to this one. So let's look at one of the larger ones and you'll see kind of how simple it is. So we're saying Pancake View, giving it a background color, defining the border type, the border radius, border thickness, and then most of it is telling it what colors to define in the gradient. So we're telling it the 6 colors that we want to include in our gradient. So most of them, and this is the multicolor. So this is one of the more complex pieces on screen, and really this is only a few lines. Most of the yeah,
Does it support CSS as well, this one?
Yes, everything like Xamarin supports CSS, period, end of sentence. So any one of these properties that you have set here, you can change with CSS. Yeah, I could hack and slash away the labels, but really just ignore these because that's just telling you what it does. So there's quite a bit of markup on the screen, but you can see Pancake View makes some really nice controls. All right, I'm not going to take this into full screen. Okay, icons. So you already saw that social screen. We'll go back to that if I can figure out where the icon is for it. Not going to be able to. Oh, it's right here in front of my face. All these icons on screen here are font icons loaded from Font Awesome Brands. So if you've had some experience building mobile apps and tried to deal with the different DPIs and different display resolutions, you end up doing a lot of image resizing, and it's really tedious and it's not a lot of fun. So anything that you have that's monochrome that you can put in a font package instead, if you work with font glyphs on the web, you can reuse those in here in Xamarin Forms. You can include those in your project and reference them from Xamarin Forms quite easily. The tabs along the bottom, these are also font glyphs. So it's really easy to use these fonts. Don't have to muck around with resizing a whole bunch of images for each platform because each platform is different too, and maintaining that across both. You just use a font package. So you drop the font in, you register it, and away you go. You start using it. So I'll show you a quick glimpse of that code. We'll get this one off screen because I think it scared everybody. I'm looking at the wrong project because I'm jumping between two. I wanted to consolidate it all together today, and I brought up this project, and it took me like about an hour to get it running because I mucked things up in my branch. So that was fun, and I didn't want to undo it because I wanted to use the latest tools. So okay, so I've got my social icon. This is a custom class that takes an icon in. I'm referencing my a static variable, and I'm saying I'm going to use the fontawesomebrands.github. So this is basically, I'm telling it that I want to use this glyph. This is actually mapped to glyph, the actual code for the font character I want to use. So if we actually go and take a look, let's look at a couple different things. So let's look at my Font Awesome Brands. That's going to be in my fonts folder. So in here, this is a bit of a hacky way to do it. There's actually a developer that has a NuGet package that you can bring in for each one of the Font Awesomes or the well-known font glyphs that they've already mapped all these for you. So you just drop that in and then you just use it. This was written far before that, so I keep my hacky ways because sometimes I like my hacky ways. I don't want to change them because it breaks my build and things like that. So these are the characters that I've mapped to, and it's just loading those in as strings, and then it gets passed down to Forms. Actually knows how to render font glyphs, no problem when you tell it which font to render. My bottom tabs are, before they changed, a lot of the ecosystem is really geared towards fonts now. I haven't had a lot of chance to play with that because I've been working with older apps, but fonts are considered first class now. Xamarin Forms really, or the Xamarin team really wants to use fonts. They know it's usually the developer's weapon of choice when you have to display vector images on screen. So they've added a ton of support to make it easier to bring fonts in, easier to use fonts. Fonts on tabs are like now a first class thing. You can use them wherever you want. So it's become first class. This was written before it's first class, and yeah, that's why it's a little bit different. But even still, putting this together didn't take that much. So I registered the fonts, So in iOS, you have to do something like in your info plist. If I can figure out how to get this open in a reasonable manner. So I don't like designers for basically any files. I want to look at the markup, so let's bring up the markup here. Ooh. So let's look for font awesome. Oops. I don't want to type in there. There it is, FA. So when you register your fonts in iOS, you actually have to tell iOS that here's the fonts I want to access. So depending on where you put that in your folder hierarchy, so I'll show you where those are. They're in my assets folder, I believe, or resources folder. Resources, fonts. I think I can zoom in a little bit here. So I've got my two font packages, my two TrueType fonts. I've also defined them in my info plist to let the operating system know to load them in, and then I can start using them. Pretty straightforward. Okay, any questions on fonts? Wish I could show you the new stuff because it's pretty slick, but just haven't had time to put a demo together on that. So styles, I talked a little bit about CSS. You can do a little bit different things from CSS in the XAML markup. Like you can well, not different, similar to CSS, where you can have global rules where you're styling all of the same element. So you can have a target type that you attach a style to. So say all my labels, I want the text to be orange. I could use a target type to change all my labels orange. There's a standard color or a standard font on the label if you want. If you just want it on something like a label, you want your entries to stay different. It's a good idea to keep page-specific styles out of your app.xaml. I've got a typo in here. Out of your app.xaml. So what happens is when you load up your app and you instantiate your app, so I'll show you where that happens. So if I am starting my app, so here in my app delegate where everything gets instantiated, I new up my app here. So I'm calling new app. So that's actually creating a new instance of app and app.xaml, right? So this is the class that gets newed up. That XAML gets processed when we create a new app. And if we have a whole bunch of things in this resource dictionary, like styles or all kinds of stuff, that gets processed at startup, and it can slow your app down significantly. So you want to try and keep what you have in here relatively tight. This also shows something that I missed explaining around the fonts. This has changed a little bit too, so don't cling to this too hard, but this is basically how you register your fonts for usage throughout the app. So with that Font Awesome Brands package, I've basically told Xamarin Forms where to find it on each platform, how to reference it, because they all reference it a little bit differently. So Android references it from the name plus the name of the file plus the name of the font. iOS uses the proper name. So there's all kinds of different metadata attached to it, and they all deal with it a little bit differently. So this has changed, though. I think they consolidated this, so they've got like a facade in front of it that reads the metadata and does it for you. So yeah, don't quote me on this one though. Anyways, you want to avoid sticking all your styles in a single resource dictionary because it becomes very heavy to process on load. It'll slow down your startup time. Nobody wants an app that starts slow. So remember to not put everything up in your app XAML as far as styles go. So you can define styles on individual pages. You can keep them in outside external XML files and bring them in when you need, because they're just XAML, right? You can keep them wherever you want. Keep them in CSS files and load them selectively depending on which screen you're in. All kinds of different stuff you can do with that. This one's a little hard to read because it's so small. Maybe I'll make it full screen for a minute. I'm hoping you can get the idea here. So this is basically the idea of using dynamic styles, using a different set of styles depending on which platform and what idiom you're working on. So idiom is basically describing whether you're going to work on, whether you're running on a desktop, a phone, a tablet, a TV, or a watch, because Xamarin Forms supports all those different platforms. So you're basically saying on idiom, if you go on idiom tablet, you can have a different set of styles defined for a tablet versus a phone. Same with the differences between iOS and Android. You can detect what platform you're working with and load different styles for Android and iOS. So you get some nice flexibility there. Onto some user experience things. So is everybody here a developer? I guess I should ask that right off the bat. Yeah? Okay. Who's not a developer? I knew that. Anybody else? No? So everybody's a dev. Okay, good. Okay, so this one is big because, okay, so as developers, we're usually I don't want to generalize too bad, but we ignore user experience a lot of the time and just make it work, right? Lots of times we're addressed with or confronted with like lots of constraints around, budget or time or, some crazy requirement that your CEO wants you to put in or whatever it may be. And it's hard to get to the user experience aspect and really think of it in terms of what the user is going to see and how they're going to interact with your app. So just generally try and pay attention to this, particularly if you're on mobile. If you're releasing to a public platform, you basically are forced to pay attention to the user experience. If you're not paying attention to the user experience, you're going to see it in your App Store reviews. You're going to get 1-star and 2-star reviews all the time. So the first thing I'll say, this is very, very similar to the catch all your exceptions everywhere all the time. Don't let that app crash. Try and have graceful handling everywhere you can. But the same thing around anytime you're loading anything. So anytime you have a long running task, you want to show an activity indicator, or you want to show, like if you've got a list view or a collection view or something, you want to show that it's refreshing. You want to show the user that it's doing something. How many people have experienced an app where you press a button, you're like, what the hell is going on? And you press it 5 more times, then finally it jumps to the screen, but it loads up 5 times, so it's on the navigation stack 5 different times. Has anybody seen that before? Something similar to that? Yeah, all the time. So, like, this can't be understated. Anytime you're doing anything that contacts a remote server in particular, anything making a remote call, anything doing heavy processing, anything reading or writing from file system or database, even if it's local, system might be busy, it might not get back the way you want it to. Wrap everything in an activity indicator. So use an activity indicator. There's all kinds of different libraries you can use to do this. If anybody's familiar with Alan Ritchie, he's a friend of ours, and he has he's going to hate me for saying this because he hates supporting this library, but he's got a nice library out there that has a nice notification or a nice activity indicator. You can lay it over your screen. You can do, I'm pretty sure this is it. This is ACR Dialogues is the name of the library. I'm pretty sure that's ACR Dialogues. I'm 95% sure that's what that is. So he's gonna send me some hate mail, and that's fine. I'm used to it. particularly from him. And I'm going to tell everybody to use his library to put nice overlays on their screens because it really, really helps. Really, really helps that user understand that the app is actually doing something. And just hold on. Just hold on. Sometimes you want to block the screen too. Like sometimes you'll want to prevent the user from interacting with the screen. So you'll want to have some kind of overlay that sits behind this and just like fogs everything out so they can't, start mashing buttons. You'll want to do something like disable buttons when users press them too. So those data triggers are really nice for that. You can tell a button to be disabled as soon as a command is running. There's also a lot of the commanding frameworks, the MVVM frameworks, support a can execute. So what you can do is on your view model, you can have a is loading flag on your view model. And then you can check that in the command that you're executing on your view model. So for example, if you've got a button's bound to a command on your view model. So your button talks to your view model via a command, it invokes a command. So let's say actually you've got button A, button B. So button A, it goes, okay, button A runs off and does a big web query and you're waiting for it. But before it does that, it sets the is loading to true. So is loading gets lit up. And button B has a can execute condition. And Xamarin Forms is aware of that can execute condition. So as soon as that can execute condition is coming back false, the button shows up as disabled on screen automatically. Framework supports that out of the box. So can execute, button's disabled. You can make them both disabled until that is loading is set back to false. And the user can't mash it more than one time. They're automatically set to, or not automatically, your code's setting that Boolean value to true so it knows it's loading. The other thing you want to do is measure how much these activity indicators are on screen. So one of the things that I really learned by building a lot of mobile apps is things are always going to take longer than you expect, particularly if you start running on older devices in the middle of nowhere. So if you're pulling down large data sets, if you're pushing up large data sets, if somebody's got a really, really old phone, which happens a lot more than you'd think, particularly in a lot of niche scenarios, you really want to make sure that you're measuring what's going on and reporting it back to your analytics tool, whatever that may be. I tend to use App Center and Application Insights. I actually like using both. And you can log and kind of figure out where people are spending time in your app, and if they're seeing the activity indicator more than they're interacting with the app, you probably need to make some changes. Empty states. I'm actually going to bring up this page because this is kind of nice. So don't show your user a blank screen. Give them something friendly to state how they can take an action. That's what this basically boils down to. Set this up. Cool. Okay, well, that used to have, this is a dead link clearly, used to have a bunch of examples on well done empty screens. Anyways, get a little creative. You can see a lot of them will have pointers to, click this button to create your first entry or whatever it may be. Just don't leave the user with staring at a blank screen. Okay, so the next piece is something I'm relatively passionate about. I think anybody who works with me will know this, but offline detection is super important. Who takes the subway? I take the subway, yeah. Almost everybody, cool. So this is good. So you know how frustrating it is to have an app that not only does it do nothing when you're offline, but it crashes when you're offline. There's so many that I load up and I'm just like, really? You can't just check that you didn't have an internet connection? Like, what's going on? Or like a spotty internet connection, like just terrible at it. So Xamarin Essentials has a good way to, like, some just really great basic checks in there. You can put in some additional things to kind of ping a server, check for, you can have like a bit of a heartbeat on your network, and then when it drops below a certain threshold, you can toggle something in your app, like in a service somewhere, and then check that service to see if it's actually available or if your pings are timing out on, relative frequency, because Xamarin Essentials will tell you, it will report back whether you have an internet connection. It doesn't tell you anything about the quality of that internet connection. Apple does not tell you, it will tell you if you are on cell or Wi-Fi. It will not, Apple's iOS does not tell you any more than cell or Wi-Fi. That's all it tells you. Android will tell you if you're on Wi-Fi, if you're on LTE, 4G, 3G, Edge. So you can kind of make some assumptions based on that, but iOS will only tell you it's very, very black and white. You either have no connection, Wi-Fi, or cellular. So I like to have something that runs just periodically every couple of seconds and makes an arbitrary request just to see what the response time and latency is like. That gives us a nice idea of whether we actually have a stable connection, whether we should be communicating with the server or not. Retry buttons are also really nice. Around offline capabilities, so if you are planning on gracefully handling when you don't have a network connection, there's two ways of going about it. You can use some kind of caching tool. I've listed just two of many here, Monkey Cache and Akavash. So if you're using anything reactive, Akavash is going to be your friend. Monkey Cache is a very, very generic, very easy to use utility that James Montemagno maintains, which is very simple and easy to use. If you're using Sync, there's a bunch of different flavors out there. Your mileage is going to vary on that. Depends on what your backend looks like. If you want to use App Center Offline, App Center Offline basically requires a couple things. First of all, it's going to use Cosmos, so you have to be NoSQL friendly. Number two, you have to use App Center Auth. App Center Auth is basically some nice dressing on top of Azure AD B2C. So if you're familiar with that, that's a lot of letters and numbers. But it's Azure's Active Directory service, so what you used to have in the enterprise, but they ported it to the cloud, and now it does business to consumer. So you can actually have your consumers authenticate using Active Directory through Azure, which is cool, but it's not what everybody wants all the time. So, there's some specific cases there. My friend Daniel Causer and I engineered a very nice SQLite generation tool. I'm going to give him actually all the credit for it, because I went, you should do this, and made like this sweeping, you should build the thing. And he went and built the thing. And he actually does a really good job. If you check out Daniel's GitHub, he's got a really good example in there. He will generate a SQLite database on in a web app hosted on Azure and he loads like, I don't know, 100,000 records into the SQLite database in like a second, and then streams it back to the client, and it's like super small. It's like, 300K or something ridiculous like that. So it's a really good way to use that. We've actually used that in production in a couple of apps, and it works fantastic. So if you need to do have all the data for a tenant available on their mobile client, like as soon as they log in, it's a really great way to do that. Another one is Realm. Another mixed results. Couchbase is another one. So those are more like object stores where you're serializing objects, and then the serialized object syncs across the network, and pseudo real time. Couchbase has put a lot of work into theirs. I probably should have put them on this slide. I don't know why I did. Here, let's fix this right now. There, Couchbase is now on the slide. So check out Couchbase. Actually, I'd say check them out before Realm. They have a little bit more involvement in the Xamarin community, and they did a really great demo where they were drawing. They had 2 mobile tablets with an app installed, And you know what? Let me find this. They have a really, really nice. Here we go. They have a nice animated GIF somewhere. It's not this one. This one? No, it's definitely by Rob. Here we go. This is it. So, like, that's pretty cool. So it's synchronizing. It's basically saving to the Couchbase DB all that data, all the vector data about what's being drawn, and syncing it to the other device. And it works two ways. I don't know how conflict detection works in this, if one goes offline and the other one comes back online and somebody scribbled all over the screen. But
Need 3 phones and an election.
yeah, exactly. Interesting nonetheless. I think this is a Xamarin app. I'm pretty positive that this is a Xamarin app using Skia. Yeah. And yes, this is definitely a Xamarin app using a Skia canvas view. So Couchbase is cool, something worthy to check out. This one's kind of interesting. So I've just got a bunch of slides in a row. This full screen again. Relative time. So it's a little hard to see here, but this is your typical like timeline view. 7 days ago, 1 month ago, 5 days ago. So this is using Humanizer. Who's used Humanizer? Anybody? No? It's cool. You can just basically format numeric values to human-friendly values. Now, I know this kind of thing, for me, depending on what I'm looking at, can drive me a little crazy, so don't get too carried away from it. Sometimes I want a timestamp. Just show me the bloody timestamp. I don't want to see 2 months ago. I want to see exactly which date it was posted on and the time. Personal rant there. But yeah, don't get too carried away because you might actually take away from the user experience and you might have a whiner like me complaining about it. Multi-language support. So this one, I really recommend if you're building any apps to use resource files from the start and load all your string values from resource files, even if you're only supporting English. Because if your company gets acquired by a Japanese subsidiary, like let's say Rakuten buys your company because they buy everybody now. So Rakuten buys your company and you've got your app written in English, but you go, hey, we got resource files, so let's get going with Japanese. You send it to the translator, you come back with your new resource file. It all just magically works. Nothing fits on screen, but that's fine. At least it can translate, right? So then it's just ironing out some of those UI details, but like really the pain in translating is already taken care of. It also gets rid of, I actually find it, it's a bit of a double-edged sword working with resource files and working with translation, because sometimes you don't know what you're looking at. So it's kind of interesting if you're using, because you're referencing a variable somewhere that points to a resource file. That's where it becomes hard to figure out what you're actually looking at on screen. So XAML supports design time attributes that are stripped out at compilation time. Those are your friend when it comes to things like this, and can make it way easier to human read your XAML screens if you're using resource files from the start. Animations. So if you haven't went and downloaded the Rate the Meet app that I talked about in one of our very early slides, and I'm just gonna show to that again. Okay, so go to the store, get the Rate the Meet. We're gonna draw for a monkey at the end of the presentation. So you'll fill out a short survey. It's usually like 5-star questions. You give a star rating and comment if you choose, and you get entered to a draw. I press a button at the end of this session and it picks one of you at random to draw to win the monkey. So That app, once you have it up, Emily built that app with one of our other colleagues, Matt, and they both love animations because they're more design focused than me. And they used a couple of really nice libraries. They use Zam animation. Man, that's so hard to say. I have to like look at it and focus to actually get it out. So Zam animation is a pretty popular library to help with you animate your Xamarin Forms views. Results in some really nice looking screens, really nice looking transitions and animations. And then you've got Lottie. Lottie is basically a way of creating, you can go out and create After Effects little animations and bring them into your app. There's really good Xamarin support for this. This was originally developed by Airbnb. They built an Android version and they built an iOS version. And then I can't remember his last name, Martin. He's a European Xamarin dev. Wrapped both native libraries and put a C# API on top of it. And so we have Xamarin, full Lottie support in Xamarin, and it works really well. It's really fancy, and we really like working with it because it looks really, really pretty. Any questions before I move on to our next piece around maintenance? Yes, no? Right. So basically maintenance is you might be maintaining, somebody else might be maintaining, but help yourself out. So we already talked about MVVM, but we didn't really talk about frameworks. There's a lot of frameworks out there that will help you with your MVVM patterns, help you build apps in a more pattern-friendly way, help support you. Prism is top of the list because it's my personal favorite. I've worked with Prism for about 4 years, and it is really, really good. It's really good at, it's highly opinionated, but that's a good thing. It keeps you on a narrow track. So it keeps you from going outside the pattern as much as possible, which is good. Reactive UI is also very nice, and you can kind of combine these two together to make them play nicely together. My good friend Shahab has done that in the past, and Emily, you did on Rate the Meet, right? So Rate the Meet is actually has used both those, Prism and Reactive UI, within their app to have it to help with MVVM, to help with managing data streams, things like that. MVVM Cross is a more it's a framework that's more friendly to if you're building your screens with native toolkits. So if you're building storyboards using Android XML and building UI platform specific, MVVM Cross is a little more friendly with that. And Fresh MVVM is another framework that's it's relatively simple. It's another way of just helping you keep your app more MVVM friendly, a little more clean, a little more testable. Dependency injection. So who is unfamiliar with dependency injection? Anyone? Okay, a couple people. Okay, so dependency injection. Let's give a really simple example. Okay, so you have a view model. Let's talk about a view model. So you've got a view model that represents a screen, what you're going to display on screen, and you have to get data and do a whole bunch of things in that screen. So say you want to do something like you want to check to see if you're online, and then you want to go and get data from the server. So you've got a repository which helps you get data from the server, and you've got like a device service, let's call it a device service, that helps you check whether you're online. So you've got two services. So if you're not using dependency injection, what you do with that new service or that device service and the repository is you would just, var my repository equals the repository, and away you'd go. You'd start using it. And same thing with the device service. Go var device service equals, or device service equals new device service, and away you'd go. So you'd new those up, and you'd start using them. All seems okay from your perspective. But then, you know, your architect comes to you and he goes, hey, Dylan, we got to make this code testable. We've had a lot of QA problems, and we want our test coverage above 80%. And right now we have no unit tests, so you have to make this testable. So if you're not using dependency injection and you're newing up those items right within your method bodies in your class that you're trying to test, you have no control over what those classes are actually doing because they're somewhere else, and you're just using those. And so if you want to test just the logic that's in your view model, say you're manipulating some data in there, so make it friendly for the screen, you can't test that in isolation. It actually is going to go and make those calls to the server, and it's going to see if it can connect to the device and see if there's a connection available. And not a lot of that is going to work in the context of a unit test. So the idea is with dependency injection, you take the public methods that are available on those services and you put them in an interface, and then you register the interface and your class in an IOC container, an inversion and control container. And what that inversion and control container will do is then supply those to your class when you ask for the class. So how does it do that? Well, you put them in the constructor. So as constructor parameters, you say, I want my iDevice service and I want my iRepository. And the IOC framework, the dependency injection framework, knows how to pass those in as constructor parameters, so then you can use them in your class. And that gives you the ability to do some really interesting things. Because it's based on an interface and not an actual class, you can do things like use a mocked implementation of that interface. So there's frameworks out there that will look at that interface, and it will allow you to build dynamic behavior on top of that, so you can control what's going on and simulate a connection to the web. So say I'm on an airplane and I have no way to connect to the web. Now, like, this is a little bit different because I'm old, and airplanes with Wi-Fi are still a novelty to me. So I'm used to working on a plane with no internet connection. If I had no internet connection and tried to run something that had new repository and that repository is connecting to the web, I can't run that up, I can't run unit tests on that, I can't do anything. But if I'm mocking that, or substituting in for that class or for that implementation of that interface, I can control what my actual dependency graph looks like. So I can say, I'm not actually going to make this mock version of this interface connect to the web. It's just going to return me JSON every time. Just this hard-coded JSON string. So it's not an integration test, it's a unit test. All right, that was a long-winded tangent. I hope I did an okay job of explaining that. All right, so dependency injection is your friend. It will help you do a couple things, like it'll immediately help make your classes more testable. It will also really help help you control your dependency graph, help you do things like if you're running UI tests, you don't want again, that's the same kind of scenario where if you're running a UI test, you don't necessarily want to be testing your connection to your API or testing on anything on your API. You just want reliable data that you can test against. So it gives you that flexibility to substitute things in and out, which is awesome. I make a note here. So most MVVM frameworks already have some opinionated support for different MVVM frameworks. I am a big fan of AutoFac. I think it's great, but it's got an immutable container, which means that once you have your dependencies set, they are set. You cannot change that. And Prism requires a mutable container that you can change along the way. So Prism has discontinued AutoFac support. So I have two choices. I can stick with an older Prism version, or I can drop AutoFac. So I'm kind of torn on this. AutoFac is really nice. So if you're looking for a good IOC framework, AutoFac is awesome. There's a whole bunch out there. There's Dry IOC, there's Unity, list goes on. Usually MVVM frameworks are predisposed to have support for certain DI containers. So you can do some more research on that, but lots of information out there on that. just going back, James Montemagno, so one of the big Xamarin advocates, has actually experimented with taking the DI container from ASP.NET Core, the whole DI system, and bringing it into Xamarin, and had some pretty decent results. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that actually getting folded into Xamarin in the near future. So it's already got a DI framework available out of the box. We'll see. We'll see. Abstract your dependencies. I know this very, very well because I got burned really hard by this, like in my early days. So did anybody, well, I used to work with this analytics framework called Xamarin Insights. It was from before Xamarin was acquired by Microsoft. It was their analytics package. So I got invited to like their alpha before it was even like announced, and got to play with it, and it was really cool, and I reported gobs of data back to it, and it was awesome. And then they went live with it, and we shipped it to production in an app, and it was giving us all kinds of great analytics, and we could get all kinds of great information out of it. It was awesome. And then they were bought by Microsoft, and they announced it'd be deprecated like a month after the acquisition. It was like they were acquired, and then Xamarin Insights was gone because Microsoft already had a hockey app, and they weren't going to continue with two products in the exact same space. So I was using Xamarin Insights everywhere. I was using it to time methods. I was using it to track my user habits, like all kinds of different things. I had tons of information in there, and it was scattered throughout my app. So everywhere I was calling Xamarin Insights directly. And yeah, I learned really hard that I really shouldn't have done that, because then as soon as it was deprecated, I had to go through and tear it all out. And the new API for Hockey App was quite a bit different from Xamarin Insights, and it didn't support a lot of the same things. So I was left going, well, I have nowhere to report this information, and just stripped it all out. I learned a really good lesson. If you're going to take a dependency, it's probably a good idea to abstract it and wrap it in something that you own. So that if you have to change that, if I have to change Xamarin Forms, now I'm going to do like a telemetry logger provider. And that telemetry logger provider class will call Xamarin Insights or Hockey App. And it'll only be called from that, and then I will consume my telemetry logger provider everywhere throughout my app. So if I have to change from Hockey App to App Center, which was the next thing that happened, I had to migrate a bunch of apps there too. But I'd learned, and it was all abstracted out to my telemetry logger provider, and I just changed it in one spot. It was really nice. So only have to change it one place. You can do things like do some composite logging, so you can combine. I think I mentioned I like to log to App Center and Application Insights. They both give you different granularity on what you can report on. App Center is really good at rolling things up, and really terrible at giving you like row level information on what's been reported. Application Insights is kind of both, but you have to build your own roll-ups. So I like to report to both, and that way I can get every little bit of information if I want it, and which App Center doesn't necessarily provide. So I log to both. And that's done in a composite logger, and I do that everywhere. And you can extend functionality. So I've got things like my logging services will collect a bunch of metadata from the user, like a bunch of contextual metadata, like it'll grab user's ID and email and everything that's on their navigation stack, all kinds of different info, and add that into the error log. So I can see, what got them to this point, some pieces of critical information about them, some context from when the error occurred. Automate testing, I kind of talked on that around DI. So unit testing, super important. That's actually testing what's in a method, in a public method, and any private methods that may call from a class. So that's all you want to test in a unit test. And that's done using code, and you want to set things up nicely where you create your mocks, and then you actually act on the service and method that you're trying to act on, and then you assert that everything that should have happened happened. Pretty simple. Functional testing, that's when you're testing within the bounds of your app and maybe testing how things flow from one end to the other, or how a round trip looks like or something like that. These terms are my terms. I don't think they're what a professional tester. I'm pretty sure Roxy was at the back earlier, and I'm pretty sure she'd be giving me shit right now for using these terms the way I am. I don't care. These are just what I use to refer to these. Integration test is when you actually start talking to other pieces of your system. So integration test is something like, I want to have something and I want to see how it communicates with the Meetup API. And I want to actually see how that integrates. So I send a request, I want to make sure it goes out to Meetup, it comes back with the correct data, and I see that come out the other end. Integration test. UI testing is actually simulating user interacting with the UI. And so that really, these start getting more cumulative as you move towards the bottom of the screen here, towards the bottom of that list. Where UI testing is testing everything. It's testing your UI, it's testing everything that you would have tested in integration testing, likely, everything you would have tested in functional testing and unit testing. So the nice thing about building it is if you build it in this way, as you're developing your unit tests, you develop a whole bunch of mocks for your external dependencies, which then you can use in your functional tests, which then you can use in your integration tests, so you can only test one integration at a time, which then you can use in your UI tests, so you can test either integrating to your external dependencies or not, by flipping over depending on whether you're going to use a mocked service or a real service. So it gives you that ability to kind of control what you're testing and how thorough you're being in your testing, and really control, like if you've got something that say might change because I'm testing with user X and user X is a test account used by somebody else, it could potentially change my test results. I might want to mock that piece. Package updates. Who has been burned by NuGet package updates in the past? Just hitting update all and then just going, oh, nothing works, everything's bad and broken and terrible. Yeah, everybody has. Anybody who didn't put their hand up is a liar. So you have to approach this with caution. I say read the release notes. Sometimes I will do this, sometimes I will not. It depends on what it is. But what's that?
For major versions, I guess you should.
Major versions for sure. Xamarin releases for sure. They're much better now. If you've been working with Xamarin for a while, it's so much better now than it was a couple years ago. So read the release notes. Make sure you create a new branch. You don't want to poison your code base. Keep it isolated. So if you're not using Git, use Git. That's all I gotta say. Don't not use Git. And have a test plan, because you're gonna have to do some regression testing. There's a lot of times you'll upgrade your packages and it'll break something like buried way deep in your app that you never would have thought would have ever broken with this, and it breaks. So if you are planning on doing this, make sure you're already doing it during a scheduled test cycle where it's going to get regression tested, or explicitly engage a testing team, or make sure you have time allotted to test. It's super important. Again, I've got caught by this before, so careful. Any questions, comments? No? This one you can't avoid. So if you're building mobile apps, you have to pay attention to OS updates. This happens every summer. There's a big Google I/O event. There's the Worldwide Developer Conference for Apple. They change the operating system functionality underneath your app, and sometimes that will break your app completely. Pay super close attention to these. Super close. If possible, have test devices available for beta testing. So get the beta software. Run your apps. See if they work. This is not always possible. They're not. But make sure people are aware. Yell and scream and shout that this is going to be something coming down the line. If you've got stakeholders that are involved and know that you've got a critical path, tell them like, hey, iOS 13 is going to come out and it is going to break everything. People are going to update to Catalina and they're going to yell and scream on Twitter because none of their stuff's going to work, which I've seen a lot of. So be aware that these changes come and there's nothing you can do about them. People will get these updates and it will break your stuff. Guaranteed. It will break something. Particularly if you have multiple apps in the store, it's going to break at least one thing on one app. So you got to pay attention to it. So this kind of goes back to this one, because if you have those UI tests, you just run them on the new devices and you know where you stand. Now UI tests are tricky, so test golden path first and build out from there, because it's really hard to build UI tests and they become very brittle very quickly, break all the time when you make UI changes. So yeah, your mileage will vary on that. There's also like a little bit, there's a layer of testing that kind of exists between functional and UI tests, where you can mock your whole UI and interact with a Xamarin app just through code instead of actually launching the UI. I can't remember what that toolkit is called. It's kind of escaping me right now. I wish I would have wrote it down and put it in the slide. But if you get, like, if you're really into testing and you want to automate your tests, you can go looking for it. Okay, so that's OS updates. Pay attention to that one. Security. So this one's important because I see all kinds of crazy stuff and probably do crazy stuff that I'm not even aware of. So I'm going to talk about it in two different manners. To start, I'm going to talk about data at rest and data in transit. Data at rest, use secure storage. So Xamarin Essentials Secure Storage uses both the keychain service in iOS and the Android key store and a shared preferences file on Android. It's an abstraction on top of that. So this is your friend, very helpful. If you're going to put sensitive user data in SQLite, make sure it's encrypted. There's actually libraries out there that will do that for you. Again, I should reference that. Slides made in haste. You can find it if you Google for it. It's pretty well known. Make sure you store files in the correct path. There are two types of file storage on a mobile device. There is basically internal storage on Android and external storage, and I can't remember the terms for iOS. Slightly different. I think it's personal and shared, something like that. But one is available, so if you're using internal or personal, that's only available to your app. If you store it in shared or external, it's available throughout the system. So don't put your SQLite database there, because then it will be available to everybody, or all apps, and they'll scan and do all kinds of nasty stuff to it. Data in transit. Use a secure transfer protocol. So for most of us, this is HTTPS. And don't roll your own authentication. Never, ever, 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 ever. Code obfuscation. I've never actually used this. Has anybody used a code obfuscator? No? No, I haven't either. This is actually super advised if you're doing Android development, because it's super easy, and I've done this before. It's super easy to lift an APK built with Xamarin, grab it, extract it, and see the code, right? It takes like a couple minutes. So I can decompile an app and actually look at the code within, I can open the DLLs and reflect on them and see the code in there in like a couple minutes time. So if you've got sensitive stuff that you've got hard-coded and you think you're smart because it's hard-coded and nobody can see your compiled code, that is not correct at all. People can see that hard-coded value. If you've got a key hard-coded, people can see it, they can pick it. So be aware. There's a lot. Obfuscator, I think, is built into Visual Studio. That might have changed. And I think it's only Visual Studio for Windows. And there's lots of OSS stuff out there, so there's open source free available tooling out there to do some code obfuscation. Performance. So fast is definitely a feature. Android's really bad at images, really bad. So use Glide. Glide is actually kind of being rolled into the Xamarin Forms framework, so you probably don't have to worry about it as much in the future. But for right now, I would really recommend using FF image loading. So FF image loading is a great library that does It handles resizing in an optimized manner. It handles streaming and caching in an optimized manner. So it makes it really easy to manage those, and you can load it right from a URL. There's all kinds of great stuff it does from you or for you. Highly recommend that library if you're doing anything around anything image heavy. I used this utility first for a list that had like an image heavy cell in it, and it went from being unusable to being lightning fast just by changing out image to the FF image loading control. Compiled bindings. So you can actually tell in XAML, you can tell it, tell your bindings what data type you're using. It makes it faster so it doesn't have to do reflection at runtime. It compiles ahead of time and will tell, it will be basically hard-coded. Makes things a lot faster. Along with this, I didn't have this in here, but compiled XAML, turn on XAML compilation, makes your app a lot faster. If you're dealing with lists of data, there's three major ways to deal with it. There's a bindable layout. Bindable layout means any of those layouts we talked about before. So, well, any of the more flexible ones. So flex layout and stack layout can both be bound to a list of data, so you can have it repeat. It almost acts like an old school repeater for anybody who used ASP.NET web forms. See, Emily? So old school repeater, so it just binds your layout. It doesn't perform very well, so you shouldn't use it for large sets of data, but it's really great if you've got like a really small set of data. If you're using a list view, and this is probably what most people are doing to display lists of data these days, you want to use a caching strategy of recycle element, so it's not constantly recreating new cells and disposing of cells. You want to just have like a set of 6 fixed that rotate through. If anybody's using collection view, you want to use, well, and list view, you want to use pre-designed cells. So Xamarin comes with a bunch of cell types that are out of the box optimized. So that's your text cell, your image cell, entry cell, and a switch cell, I think. They're all optimized. If you use a view cell, which gives you the freedom to use any controls in there, it's not optimized, so your mileage will vary. Don't make it too complex. It's going to slow your screen down. Collection view is a lot better than list view as far as optimization goes, but it's also very new, so there are some flaws in it still. They're still working on it and still improving it. I talked about measuring performance before, and I want to just talk about it again. Measure performance of your app. Know how long it takes to start. Know how long it takes to do X, Y, Z. Every little bit of your app should be measurable so you can figure out where your bottlenecks are, what you need to improve. That feeds back into user experience, right? So if you've got a slow app, people aren't going to like using your app. They're going to uninstall it or give you a bad review in the app stores, which is important. As far as application design goes, who's familiar with the lazy type? Cool. Lazy is really your friend in Xamarin. Anything that you can make lazy, do it. And of course, you're going to have to test that because it doesn't always work the way you expect it. So use a lazy type. Lots of DI frameworks will support that out of the box too. So you register your interface and then you ask for lazy of type T, of type your interface, and it knows what to do. AutoFac's really great at that actually, which is nice. And careful with your dependencies on startup, and I said especially remote calls. So if you're loading a bunch of stuff that you need to load your initial screen, it's going to be slow. You want to start. It's probably good to be strategic to have your screen load in a staged manner or a slim manner where the user's going to see that initial screen as quickly as possible, and then you can kind of build off of that. So just careful that you try and keep it as slim as possible. Keep it as simple as you can with the initial screen that the user is going to see. And really avoid making a remote call right off the bat. Anything that you can cache, anything that you can prepare for the user on the server side to have it so you don't have to do any data transformation or anything like that will really help you in that matter. Android, of course, needs some special care because the Android startup times are still undergoing improvements. So turn on startup tracing. This is that new feature that was announced just a short time ago. Android app bundle support is going to be a good thing for your app size. So basically it allows you to ship just for the store will slim down your app just for the specific device that's downloading the app from the store. So that's a really nice feature. Keeps your app package nice and tiny. And then disable multi-dex because multi-dex is just basically for when you have, I can't remember the limit, but Java's got a limit of calls. 65,000 methods that you can have, yeah. So if you've got more than 65,000, you have to use multi-dex and it breaks it into multiple packages. Most of the time you're not going to need that, so turn it off if you can.
So by default, this is enabled?
I think it's off by default, but I've seen it turned on in some weird places too. So some customization, just want to just cruise through these quickly. Platform specifics are your friend. This is something that's relatively new, I think, since Xamarin 3.2 or 3.3. So this basically exposes native specific properties. So if you think of Xamarin Forms as a Venn diagram and really it's three circles, so iOS, Android, UWP. Where they all overlap, those are the Xamarin Forms controls. That's the way it has been classically. Doesn't necessarily work like that anymore. The Xamarin team is making Xamarin Forms specific controls, like a checkbox, which Apple doesn't have a checkbox out of the box. So now Xamarin Forms out of the box has a checkbox, which is great, because a lot of people want to see checkboxes. But things like controls or properties on controls that are only available for one specific platform, you can now use in your Xamarin Form code. So for iOS, the big one is that I use in almost all my apps is the safe areas. So you turn safe areas on your page and it makes sure it keeps it below the notch and above the speaker grade. So it kind of boxes it into the safe areas. I'll actually show you how that looks. I know how to use PowerPoint. It's a big if. I think it's enabled in all these pages here. So I'm just going to bring up my welcome page here. So I've got iOS page, safe area, true. So I turn on safe areas. So it only shows me in between, basically if I'm on a iPhone X or X derivative or 11 or whatever they're calling the phones now. Sometimes numbers, sometimes letters and numbers, but it knocks it up and down. So I've got everything within the usable area of the screen. So things aren't hidden behind the notch or behind the speaker grade. So there's some similar items. There's picker update mode. So the picker on Android and on iOS, they both behave a little bit differently. The Android picker only, once you've made a selection and dismiss the picker, then it updates the screen with the new value. With the iOS picker, as you're scrolling through, the one that is actually on the center of the picker is the selected item. Until you turn update mode, I can't remember what the value is, but you change the update mode, so it does it after you've made the selection, after you've actually selected the item you want. That'll prevent your screen from redrawing, or maybe you're making maybe you've got an event hooked up to that or a command that will fetch value based on what you've selected. So you don't want that selecting every time. That's a pretty common scenario. So you can change the picker update mode to only update once you've actually selected something. Android list view fast scroll, that's the little indexer on the side of the screen as you're scrolling. So if you've got an Android phone or seen an Android phone, if you've got a big list view, it gives you the alphanumeric index on the side of the screen. So like in a contacts app or something like that. So you can scroll down to D or scroll down to W if you want. And Android bottom tabs, which is a relatively new thing, relatively new standard for Android, and a relatively new thing for Xamarin, because Xamarin, if you had a tab view previously, it would always be Android tabs on the top, because there was no concept of bottom tabs, native bottom tabs, and iOS tabs on the bottom. And now you can tell it to shift the Android tabs to the bottom of the screen. They'll render with a different control, the same toolbar or whatever the Android control is called for bottom tabs. I can't remember it off the top of my head. Just a couple quick things here. So effects are they're a way of augmenting native controls to allow things to be customized that aren't available out of the box with Xamarin Forms. So basically it allows you to expose properties or create a consistent styling or manipulate native controls that are not in ways that aren't available out of the box with Xamarin Forms. So it's a way of just kind of customizing those native controls to fit the needs for your app. And then the next step after that, so if you get to the point where you're trying to customize and there are controls available that you want to use that aren't available for both platforms and aren't available in Forms, you'll want to use a custom renderer. Custom renderers allow you to expose those controls up to your Xamarin Forms project. Pretty helpful, and I wish I would have included the diagram. So the diagram that Chara and Randy included in their presentation was basically like, if you want to put a shadow on a button, use an effect. If you want a drawing canvas, use a renderer. So for the more complex things, you're going to use a renderer. For the more simple things, you're going to use effects. All right, that's what I got. Any questions from anybody? Yeah.
What do you do when it comes to those that are visually impaired or
accessibility? That's a whole other topic. We've actually got Samer. I think you've probably seen Samer present before. Samer's got a whole presentation that he's got queued up that he wants to give on accessibility. So I'm not an accessibility expert. Samer is, and I'll leave him to cover that topic, because my extensive knowledge in that subject is not great. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, let's draw for a monkey. Okay, so Andrew's gone. I hope he created the survey.
He did.
You did. Got a notification? So everybody who wants to participate in the draw in the app signed in and ready to go? Okay.
All right, this is my monkey.
is that actually the official mascot?
Yeah, that's the Xamarin Monkey. I'm gonna go grab our prize. Okay, I see 4 entries so far. Here it is. So those of you who don't win the monkey, there are some consolation prizes up on the table at the front between the 2 chairs. There are a bunch of stickers, some pins. I've got some more stickers and swag, so if you want some stuff, let me know. I've got so many stickers. Please take stickers, even if you don't want them. Give them to your friends. Just stick them to bumpers, do whatever.
All right, let's throw that monkey.
All right, how many entries we got now? Is everybody in?
I go through odds.
I'll give it another couple minutes. Oh, 5 entries.
Signal takes real time.
Yeah, we don't have signal line there. We've got push notifications, but not signal line.
So 20% chance. Code is not on GitHub.
What's that?
The code for this app is not on GitHub.
Pardon?
The code for this application.
No, not yet.
When did I go there on GitHub? There's just a reading.
Yeah. No.
I open up PR and then support for signal.
We've got, well, Meetup, because Meetup's going down and we're like hard over them, we're like, well, might as well just open source it. We were planning on open sourcing it. Now it seems obvious.
You could use this as an opportunity to test out whether or not other platforms might be better for you in showing your different events.
You know, we're happy with Meetup because the rest of like the community's on there, .NET Foundation's on there, and really .NET Foundation helps us promote our events. So we're part of the .NET Foundation, and if you go to the .NET Foundation Meetup page, our events get listed on there, which is great. And the rest of the Microsoft community is on there too, so kind of makes sense to stay on Meetup if it.
Also, their Microsoft Foundation is sponsoring, right? The cost,
Yeah, they cover
let's
our.
see if they're going to decide to change after all, because they're sponsoring all of these events.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll have to see what goes on. All right, so I've got 6 entries. Are people still filling out their surveys? Everybody done? Anybody still working on it? Some people don't want it. All right. Or are people still filling it out?
No, we're good.
We're good? All right. Did you guys fill it out?
I already have one.
You already have one? What's that?
I don't want the monkey.
All right.
I don't even know what Xamarin is.
Well, now you know.
All right. Here we go. Okay. Starting the prize draw. I think whoever wins gets a notification as well.
Xamarin Monkey.
Zishan.
Damn it.
Yay, no applause? Come on. I was like,
Everybody's sour because they want the monkey.
all right, so thanks very much, everybody. And again, just so you're more inclined, I'm actually going to grab the other stuff. Other stuff.
I think code is not on GitHub. I think he has the list of people and he picks one, you know, and then he chooses. Depending on the feedback, he picks.
It needs to be open source.
Exactly.
Monkey's
I'm gonna decompile the app and then look at it.
You can. 6 minutes, I'm telling you.
We could still be publishing a Rick version of the app, you know. Even if it's open source, we could still be publishing a Rick version.
So don't be shy, everybody. Like we've got
We're doing
tons and tons of these stickers and pins. We got Xamarin pins, Uno.
I think I have all of these guys I met there in the build conference. The Montreal guys, huh?
Yeah, Uno. They're interesting. You get a lot of support behind them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's growing a lot. A lot of people are interested.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
These are nice. Cheers, thanks, man. Get some of these.